October 2015. The Appalachian Trail, the Carver's Gap, grassy ridge bald section on the border of Tennessee and North Carolina. A pair of men, Mark Reed and Alex Holly, set out on a 3-day hike and never returned. 5 years have passed. Deep in a ravine, a few kilometers from the official trail, the mushroom pickers come across a makeshift hut made of poles and bark, and a man with a weathered face who seems to have lived here for many seasons. The case is reopened. The silent forest reveals an unmarked trail. Mark Reed and Alex Holly lived in Asheville, North Carolina. Mark was 32, worked as a designer, and was fond of film photography. Alex, a 35-year-old pharmacist, was meticulous. He liked to make a list of things, mark checkpoints, and check the weather forecast in advance. Together, they regularly went on short hikes in the Appalachian Mountains, using weekends to change their city routine to the rhythm of mountain trails. In the fall of 2015, they chose to hike the section of the Appalachian Trail between Carver's Gap and Grassy Ridge Bald. It was a classic stretch where the open mountain domes gave a wide view, and the route took 3 days without large elevation changes. The plan was simple and proven. The first day, drive to the town of Roan Mountain and spend the night in a motel. The second, get on the trail, cross Round Bald and Jane Bald and spend the night in the Grassy Ridge area. The third, return back the same way. Alex had identified the landmarks in advance. Round Bald is the first checkpoint, Jane Bald is the second. Then, a saddle with a stream to replenish water and a place to spend the night before dark. On October 9th, they checked into a small motel. There was an entry in the registration book and a date and signature on the receipt. They checked their equipment in the room: a lightweight 2-layer tent, awning, sleeping bags, mats, a gas burner with a cartridge, a small set of dishes, a first aid kit with basic medicines, raincoats, gloves, flashlights, and garbage bags. They left a spare bag with water and warm clothes in the trunk of the car. This habit showed their caution and preparation. In the evening, they visited a local eatery. Witnesses remembered them as a calm, non-confrontational couple who were looking at the forecast on their phone and discussing the route. The weather forecasters that day warned of cold winds and fog on the ridge, but no serious precipitation. For prepared hikers, the conditions were acceptable. Back at the motel, they laid out a map of the Roan Highlands area. It shows the main trail from Carver's Gap through several open domes to Grassy Ridge, as well as side trails that can be used to shorten or change the path. They marked the main route as the classic crossing along the ridge. The sunset time for that day was 1848, and Alex's notes included a note, "Parking until 1700. The next morning, October 10th, they left the car in the Carver's Gap parking lot. The ticket from the parking meter was later found by rangers under the windshield. In the glove compartment was a motel key and a few personal items. This showed that they were indeed planning to return after 2 nights in the mountains. Before leaving, they checked in at the shelter's logbook at the trailhead. There was a short entry: Carver's, Grassy Ridge. Then the route began. At the beginning of the trail, tourists often take photos in front of a sign with the name of the pass, and according to eyewitnesses, Mark also took out his film camera. It is unknown what kind of pictures he took, as the film was never seen again. Both were dressed in seasonally appropriate clothing: light jackets in the color of autumn leaves, medium-sized backpacks, trekking poles with distinctive black striped straps. It was a typical look for tourists going on a 3-day hike in October. According to the plan, the first checkpoint, Round Bald, was to be reached in less than an hour. Next was Jane Bald, then a saddle to replenish water. By the evening, they were to reach the Grassy Ridge Bald area and find a place to camp. The schedule was calculated realistically. They took into account the short day and the difficulty of the terrain. Everything about their actions showed that they were prepared. They had the necessary equipment, had taken care of water and food in advance, and had left information about the route in their journal. For experienced travelers, it was a standard weekend trip that didn't look risky. At that moment, nothing indicated that this trip would be the beginning of a story that would last for years. The 10th of October, 2015, began with a chill that quickly turned into a piercing wind on the ridge. On the lower slopes, the weather was clear, but as soon as we climbed above the tree line, the conditions changed. Forecasters' predictions were confirmed. The temperature dropped to several degrees above zero, fog swirled on the hills, periodically broken by sunlight, which opened the grass domes for a moment. These were typical conditions for October in the Carver's Gap area, short windows of visibility followed by the white wall rolling in again. Mark Reed and Alex Holly set out around 8 in the morning. Their car remained in the parking lot near the pass. The start was confirmed by an entry in the shelter's journal, Carver's, Grassy Ridge. According to the plan, the first checkpoint, Round Bald, was to be reached in less than an hour, and the second, Jane Bald, in another 30 minutes. From these domes, the route went further along the ridge, and about 1.5 kilometers later, a fork appeared. The official trail stretched straight ahead, while a less marked trail went off to the left. It went downhill and rejoined the main path, but was not recommended on maps for tourists. It was in this area that they were last seen by other travelers. 2 hikers returning from a short walk later testified that they noticed a pair of men wearing jackets and carrying backpacks. Both were walking together. One was holding a trekking pole. The fog was thick, and visibility did not exceed 20 meters. According to witnesses, the men moved confidently, without signs of disorientation. However, it was not possible to establish the exact location of this meeting. There were no landmarks in the milky haze, and the trail has several similar bends in this section. The latest digital footprints confirmed the time spent on the route. Alex's phone registered a geolocation update around 10:40. The signal came from the area between Jane Bald and the beginning of Grassy Ridge. After that, both devices went silent. No messages, no calls, no access to the network. The operator's attempts to determine the exact location were unsuccessful. The signal was short and unstable. There was also no activity on the step-counting app that Mark was using. The last synchronization had taken place the day before at the motel. The weather made any navigation difficult. According to the weather stations, in the afternoon, the cloud cover became continuous, and the temperature dropped even lower. The wind increased and the open domes felt damp, which could quickly cool the body. In such conditions, any extra hook from the route became dangerous. If you lost your orientation, it was almost impossible to find the right way back without visible landmarks. Later, the rangers noted that the area between the official trail and the side dumping posed a particular danger. The main line is well marked, but if you take a few steps to the side in the fog, you can find yourself on a less visible branch. It leads down the slope, where tourists rarely go. On a sunny day, such a mistake is easy to correct, but in low visibility and windy conditions, it's a chance to get lost and lose precious time. On Saturday afternoon, no one else saw either Mark or Alex. Their route was supposed to end on Sunday evening. They were supposed to return to the motel and pick up the car. But the key was still in the glove compartment, and the room was empty. Subsequent calls to their phones went unanswered. No other network recorded any more activity. All that remained was a brief entry in the shelter's logbook and the testimony of 2 tourists who saw them in the fog. That was the end of the trail. Then came complete silence. When Mark and Alex didn't return to the motel on Sunday night, it didn't seem like a cause for alarm. Hikers often get delayed on the route, especially if the weather is changeable and the day is short. However, on Monday, when the car remained in the Carver's Gap parking lot and the motel room was empty, the administration notified the rangers. At the same time, it became known that the room key was still in the glove compartment of the car, along with a few personal items. For experienced services, this was a clear signal. The couple had not completed the route at the scheduled time. The search operation began immediately. National Forest Service rangers arrived in the area, as well as volunteers from local communities. The base was set up at the Carver's Gap parking lot. Headquarters tents, maps, and tables with the distribution of tasks appeared there. The area was divided into sectors. First, the area between Round Bald and Grassy Ridge Bald was searched, the official route where they were last seen by other hikers. Dog handlers were involved in the search. The dogs picked up the trail from the car to the beginning of the trail, confirming that Mark and Alex had indeed taken the route. There were no further tangible results. In the fog, scents dissipate quickly, and the dogs lost their bearings on open domes. The dog handlers noted that the conditions were difficult: strong winds, low humidity, and temperature fluctuations. All this reduced the efficiency of the scent search. Later, helicopters with thermal imagers joined the operation. They flew over the area several times a day, especially at dusk, when the temperature contrast between the human body and the ground was the greatest. But the thermal cameras showed no signs of human presence on the ridge or in the surrounding forests. The report stated that visibility was severely limited by fog, and dense juniper thickets on the slopes created blind spots where the thermal imagers could not detect a heat signature. The volunteers combed the trails in small groups, using the chain method. They walked in parallel at a distance of several meters, carefully checking the ground and bushes. They were looking for anything, a piece of cloth, a shoe print, a food wrapper, but the results remained zero. The snow that had fallen on the ridge that night could have completely erased the small prints. In the early days, the official hypothesis was simple: trauma and disorientation. With this combination, even a trained hiker runs the risk of getting lost. If one of them was injured on the slope, the other could stay close by and not be able to call for help on their own. Reports indicated that it was the fog and strong winds that could have led anyone off the route who did not find a mark on a tree or stone in time. The coordination center worked every day. The search sectors were gradually expanded, from the main trail to the adjacent dumps, from open domes to deeper ravines. Dozens of volunteers from local clubs and rescuers from other districts joined the operation. Each new day brought only confirmation. The couple left no obvious traces. Searchers also checked shelters and shelters where tourists sometimes stay. None had any records or traces of Mark and Alex's whereabouts. All the data was collected at the headquarters. Maps marked in red those places where the groups had already passed, and in blue, new tasks. A few days later, the situation became critical. The food and water they could take would last for a maximum of 3 days. If they got off the route on the first day, time was against them. Forest thickets and steep slopes could hide the wounded for a long time, and cold nights reduced the chances of survival without shelter. Officially, the search operation lasted almost a week. Hundreds of people were involved, and dozens of kilometers of routes were combed. But there was not a single find that could definitely belong to Mark or Alex. Only silence, which could not be broken by dogs, thermal imagers, or volunteer groups. The report drawn up at the end of the first week stated, "The probable cause of the disappearance is trauma and subsequent disorientation in poor visibility and difficult weather. Further searches yielded no results." This conclusion became the official version at the time, and so began a story in which every new day only emphasized the emptiness of the traces. The mountains that they knew as a place of relaxation suddenly turned into a space that gave no answers. When the first week of searching ended without any results, some volunteers and rangers began to check areas that were not formally part of the main route. These were side paths, dumps, and small ravines a few kilometers from the ridge. It was then that a detail emerged that briefly gave us hope. In a young forest, about 3 to 5 kilometers from the official trail, we found 2 things that seemed suspicious. The first one was a nylon tie, which is often used to fix equipment. It was lying near the roots of a tree, slightly pressed into the damp soil. Visually, it looked relatively new, without significant damage. The second one was a piece of a track pole strap, striped, black with a white thread along the edge. These were used in several popular models, sold in local sports stores. Several dark spots were found on the surface of the strap. Further analysis showed microtraces of blood. It was impossible to determine its origin on the spot, so the sample was sent to the laboratory. The location of the discovery raised questions. This place was off the beaten path. There was no official trail leading to it, and an ordinary tourist would hardly have accidentally found himself in that part of the forest. There were young thickets, fallen trees, and steep slopes all around. To get here, one had to deliberately turn off the route and walk several hundred meters off-road. The rangers recorded the findings, but in their official reports, they were cautious. The theory was that the remains could have belonged to any of the visitors. A piece of the strap could have come off a few years ago, and the nylon tie could have been a remnant of the garbage that others had taken into the forest. The stains on the strap were explained as possible traces of rust or dirt. Only after laboratory analysis did it turn out that it was blood. However, the initial results failed to identify its origin, human or animal, in the first results. Unofficially, searchers and volunteers began to talk about something strange. If it was just a piece of equipment, it would be logical to find it closer to the trail or at a halt. Such a fragment is rarely found deep in the thicket without further explanation. Moreover, this fragment was lying next to a nylon tie, an item that is rarely found on the trails by itself. Taken together, they did not look like accidental remnants, but like things that someone had consciously or unconsciously left behind during the incident. Service officials emphasized that there was no direct evidence that the items belonged to Mark or Alex. They did not have serial numbers or other features that could be linked to a specific pair. Even the color and type of strap were not unique. Dozens of tourists could have had similar models. But the fact that they were found a few kilometers from the main route left the question open. There was a version among the volunteers that one of the men could have gotten off the trail looking for a shortcut or trying to avoid the strong winds on the ridge. Others believed that the items could have been carried by animals or water after heavy rains, but even these explanations did not give an answer to why the strap with the spots was so far away from the alleged place of disappearance. The headquarters decided to comb the surrounding square more thoroughly. For several days, groups checked the young forest and ravines nearby, but nothing more could be found. There were no clothes, no remains of a tent, and no other items that would point to a specific person. The findings were the only ones in this sector. Eventually, they were labeled as unidentified objects in official reports. This meant that they were taken into account, but not recognized as direct evidence. For investigators, it looked like random garbage. For those who had personally combed through kilometers of forest and seen the complete absence of any other traces, these two things looked like a strange discrepancy in the overall picture. If the first days could be explained by the elements, fog and disorientation, now there was an element that defied logic. Fragments of equipment in a place where there should have been nothing. After several weeks of searching without any conclusive results, investigators began to look more closely at the broader context of the area. The Roan Highlands area attracts more than just tourists. It is also known as a place where so-called black diggers operate, people who illegally collect ginseng roots or other valuable plants. Add to this poachers who set traps for game, and you get a picture of an area where parallel systems of forest use exist. Rangers who have worked here for years told the searchers that in the outskirts, you can often come across wire loops placed deep in the ravines. They are designed to catch deer or smaller animals. For an outsider, such traps can pose a serious danger, especially in the fog when they are difficult to see. If you get caught in them, injuries are almost inevitable. In addition to the traps, there were also those involved in illegal logging and pot brewing in the area. From time to time, the rangers came across the remains of artisanal distillation devices or caches with canisters of alcohol. This explained why they sometimes met strangers in the forest who were clearly not tourists. The locals were well aware that in the remote gullies, one could come across people who did not want anyone to see their activities. Another detail was mentioned separately. Some of the rangers had encountered the use of pepper mixtures as an improvised alarm. They were sprayed around hidden areas to scare away casual visitors, and at the same time to smell if someone was making their way through the thickets. These were artisanal methods, but they worked. In thick air, even traces of capsaicin could cause eye and throat irritation. For an uninformed person who accidentally entered such a zone, this meant sudden disorientation and panic. Could this be related to the disappearance of Mark and Alex? No, there is no direct evidence. None of the traps found had evidence that the couple had been trapped in them. No traces of conflict or things that would clearly indicate outsiders were found. But the very existence of such illegal plots changed the framework of the case. If earlier, the official version was based on the hypothesis of trauma plus disorientation, now they had to take into account the fact that there were outside forces operating in these mountains that did not want witnesses. Inside the search group, they began to speak cautiously. It's not just the elements. The idea was simple. Mark and Alex could have become accidental witnesses to the activities of people who had reasons to remain invisible. In the best-case scenario, they wandered into an area with traps resulting in injury and an inability to get out. In the worst case, they met those who did not want their presence to be disclosed. these assumptions were not included in the official press releases. They continued to repeat the version about loss of orientation and cold nights that could have been fatal. But there was a growing feeling among those who worked directly in the field that there were too many white spots in the case. If the weather alone could explain everything, there should have been at least some ordinary traces: pieces of equipment, pieces of cloth, a garbage bag left behind. Instead, there was none of this. The Rangers also cited examples from the past. A few years earlier, 2 teenagers had disappeared in a neighboring county and were never found. At that time, searchers came across traps in the remains of illegal camps, but they could not prove a direct connection. This created a background. There is a life in the mountains that does not appear on maps and does not follow the rules, and it can be as dangerous as the elements themselves. For Mark and Alex's families, this information was another painful layer of uncertainty. If at first they had hoped that their loved ones had simply gotten lost and could still return, now another possibility emerged. They could be drawn into circumstances over which they had no control. This made the story even more disturbing and confusing. As a result, official documents remained cautious. No additional evidence of outside interference was found. But those who worked in the search teams remembered this stage differently. It was then that the phrase "third force" was first used in the case, an invisible presence in the mountains that could have become part of the story of the disappearance. 5 years have passed. In the fall of 2020, the Roan Highlands area was once again in the spotlight. That season, several camera traps were set up to track the movements of black bears. One of the pictures, taken from a camera deep in a ravine, showed a figure that did not resemble an animal. The grainy footage showed an emaciated man in tattered clothes with an overgrown face. He was bending down to the stream, holding what looked like a wooden stick. At first, it seemed that he might be a homeless person or a hermit, but the place was too far from the roads for someone to have gotten there by accident. When the Rangers went to check it out, they came across a hut made of bark and poles. Inside, there was a bed made of branches, the remains of a stonework for a fireplace, a few cans and worn clothes. The hut looked like it had been used for a long time. Not far away, they saw the man from the photos again. He tried to run away, but was stopped. When his identity was checked, the unbelievable came to light. It was Mark Reed, who disappeared in 2015. He was immediately hospitalized. The doctors noted critical weight loss, signs of exhaustion, and old, improperly fused fractures on his ribs and arm. Thin scars were found on his wrists, which looked like old traces of constriction. At the same time, Mark's condition did not allow him to give a coherent testimony. He spoke in fragments, confused events, and could not clearly name the date or explain how he ended up in the forest. The doctors diagnosed a condition close to dissociative fugue, a rare disorder where a person loses memories of their past after a traumatic event and can live for years in new circumstances. His behavior confirmed this. He could not immediately recall his name, did not recognize his relatives, but was well oriented in the surrounding trees and streams as if this was his world. Despite the amnesia, some images were coming to light. During his first conversations with doctors, he repeated fragments of words: metal ringing, pungent smell, night fire. No one could understand what they meant. These were not explanations, but rather fragments of memory that did not fit together. Investigators suggested various options. Metal ringing could be a shot or a collision of objects. Pungent smell could be the pepper mixture that the Rangers had told them about. Night fire could be the remains of the camp or a fire. But there was no confirmation. Only these 3 images remained in his memory. Mark's meeting with his family was both joyful and disturbing. They recognized him immediately, but he reacted aloofly, as if he were seeing them for the first time. The relatives talked about a second birth, but the investigators saw it primarily as a chance. Mark was alive, and this made it possible to finally shed light on the disappearance. Despite this, the main question remained open. What happened to Alex Holly? Not a single thing that could have belonged to the second man was found in the hut where Mark lived. There were no signs of cohabitation or camping equipment for the two. Mark could not explain why he was alone. The discovery from the camera trap became a sensation for the local community. The missing man, who had been considered dead for 5 years, returned alive. This gave rise to hope. Perhaps the truth exists and can still be found. But at the same time, the situation remained dark. All he could give were fragments of memory of metal, smell, and fire. He had survived, but there was no answer to the main question. Hope returned with him, but with it came a new shadow. In the first weeks after his hospitalization, doctors tried to understand what exactly had happened to Mark Reed during his 5-year absence. His physical condition stabilized, his weight gradually recovered, and his wounds healed. But the situation was different with his memory. It remained fragmented, torn into shreds that did not add up to a coherent story. Psychotherapists who specialized in post-traumatic disorders began working with Mark. The sessions were held in quiet rooms of the hospital with a minimum of stimuli. He was encouraged to draw, write short words, and answer simple questions. Instead of a linear narrative, fragments emerged: metal ringing, pungent smell, night fire. Sometimes he would name individual details: slope, tree root, fallen log, but could not explain how they were connected. In conversations, he often jumped from topic to topic. One night he mentioned a night when there was light and smoke. The next he said that he was walking down and couldn't see the path. There was no chronology. The same events could be repeated with different accents, and some passages contradicted each other. For psychotherapists, this was a typical manifestation of a dissociative fugue. The psyche protects itself by dividing traumatic memories into fragments that do not add up to a coherent picture. Meanwhile, medical examinations added new data. Toxicological analysis revealed traces of contact with capsaicin, the main component of pepper mixtures. This could explain his references to a pungent odor. Probably, he really got into an area where improvised alarms with pepper spray were used. Another finding was even more disturbing. A small metal fragment, similar to a piece of shot, was found in his thigh. It had remained in the tissue for years, overgrown, and only partially caused pain. This fact was confirmed. Mark had experienced a physical injury that had never been treated in time. Despite this, he avoided the topic that interested investigators the most: Alex Holly. When asked about him, Mark would react nervously, look away, or talk about something else entirely. It seemed as if his consciousness was erasing this fragment, not allowing him to even touch it with words. For psychotherapists, this was also typical. The most painful memories are often blocked the most. But for the investigation, this meant a dead end. The experts realized that they could not expect him to suddenly regain his complete memory. A different approach was needed: controlled reproduction. For this purpose, so-called triggers are used: objects, smells, or sounds that can activate associations. In his case, there were already 3 key images: metal, smell, and fire. Doctors and investigators began to prepare conditions to provoke a safe return effect. According to hospital protocols, the plan included the use of a controlled sample of capsaicin in minimal doses to recreate the familiar smell, the sound of an empty shell casing to resemble the ringing of metal, and a fragment of burnt fabric found in the forest to evoke the association with night fire. These 3 elements were to become the basis for a future attempt to recover his memory. For now, his consciousness remained torn. Mark walked in circles in his own fragments, repeated the same words, but could not connect them. It was painful for the family. He was alive. They could hold his hand, but the answers they had been waiting for 5 years never came. The question was whether they would be able to piece together a picture of that night from the wreckage. When the specialists received the first fragments of Mark's consciousness, the investigators decided to check them on the ground. To do this, they took a map of the area, checked the fragments he described, and set out to walk around the forest. The first landmark was a stream with a fallen log. There are many such places in the Rhone Highlands, but one area matched his description: a small stream blocked by an old birch tree that had fallen across the water. The second marker was an old clear cut, an area with young trees and uneven stumps that were visible on the slope. That's where the searchers went. A few hundred meters away from the official trail, they found another match: a narrow dump that was not marked on the map for tourists. It led down the slope and was lost in the dense undergrowth. It was in this sector that the first material traces appeared. A scorched spot several meters in size was found on the ground. Nearby were the burnt remains of a fabric that looked like a tent awning. Several cans were piled up nearby, all thoroughly washed and without prints. In the wood nearby, experts recorded inclusions of shotgun pellets that left clear metal dots on the bark. These details did not give a complete picture, but they confirmed that something was happening in this place. The fire that broke out at night, other people's cans and gunshot marks created a backdrop that was consistent with Mark's memory. It was here that investigators collected items that would later be used as triggers for controlled replay. A fragment of burnt fabric, one of the cans, and a photo of a gun barrel with shotgun shells. So far, these elements remained only a set of scattered findings. They did not prove anything definitively, but they formed a testing ground where memory could come to life. The controlled reenactment was carried out in conditions as close to therapeutic safety as possible. The room was dimmed, with doctors and psychotherapists nearby. The objects collected during the reverse rounds were laid out on the table: a burnt fragment of fabric, a photo of a tree with traces of shot, and one of the clean cans. The goal was not to force Mark to remember by order, but to give him the opportunity to discover what had remained blocked for years. First, a weak solution of capsaicin was sprayed into the air. The almost invisible curtain of smell caused him to react instantly. His body tensed, his breathing became ragged, and his eyes moistened. In a few minutes, he began to describe the picture that was forming by itself. Then, he was given a cold metal flashlight in his hand. His fingers trembled, and he seemed to see a night camp, a small fire laid out on a slope, fog growing around him, and sudden movements in the darkness. A scene came to mind where their peace was disturbed by the appearance of strangers. Shadows appeared from the thicket, followed by a cloud of acrid aerosol. My eyes began to burn, and it became difficult to breathe. The picture became clearer and clearer. A fight at the campfire, screams, chaos, an attempt to support Alex and pull him away from the light. Then, a jerk down the slope, the feeling of a strong blow to his leg. He fell into a loop, the metal cut into his body, and then complete darkness. His memory brought him back to the moment of awakening. The fire went out, and smoke hung over the ground. There was emptiness around him. He did not see Alex. Instead of looking for a path, he began to wander chaotically. He walked without direction, avoided any people, and could not bring himself to return. Guilt and fear paralyzed his will, and it was in this state that he began to exist as a hermit. Investigators verified his words on the spot. Where he had indicated, they did indeed find metal inclusions of shot in the trunk. Under the log was another burnt fragment of an awning. This confirmed that his memories were not fiction. When the session ended, he met with Alex's family. Emotions were running high, but not through long explanations. He said only a few words of apology, short and quiet. It was enough to make it clear that he remembered the main thing and admitted his guilt. For the investigators, this was the culmination of the investigation. The fragments formed a complete picture of that night. For his family, it was a painful confirmation of their worst suspicions. Although material evidence was found in the case, there were still no definitive answers. After Mark Reed's memory was restored, the investigation received a new impetus. His story gave the first sequence of events on the night of his disappearance, but legally it was not enough. The main obstacle was that Alex Holly's body was never found. Without it, any version remained incomplete, and every piece of evidence was circumstantial. Investigators officially recorded that they had found gunshot wounds, burnt tent fabric, cans piled up in the area, and confirmed that Mark had a metal fragment of shot in his body. All of this was consistent with his account of the fight. However, legally, this was only enough to formulate a hypothesis, not to bring charges against unknown persons. The evidence pointed to a possible attack, but did not identify the attackers or confirm Alex's death. The case remained open. The report stated, "Circumstances indicating outside interference on the night of the disappearance have been established. However, no definitive conclusions are available due to the absence of a body and identified suspects." This wording reflected a balance between the need to record what was found and the inability to close the case. For Alex's family, this was a double burden. On the one hand, they received confirmation that something violent had indeed happened that night. On the other hand, the lack of direct evidence meant that Alex was officially considered missing. Legally, this made it impossible to even fully formalize inheritance and social issues. The family remained in uncertainty, which lasted for years. Mark underwent rehabilitation after the hospital. His physical condition gradually recovered, but psychologically, he remained broken. He cooperated with the investigation, providing all possible details, even the smallest ones. The reports recorded his attempts to help reconstruct the route, pointing out places where he saw fire or heard sounds. However, each time the search teams returned without new traces. His guilt remained palpable. He knew he had survived, while Alex was most likely dead. In conversations with psychologists, he kept returning to the topic of fear and shame. Instead of going down to the road and calling for help, he withdrew into himself, living for years in the woods, avoiding people. This feeling became his greatest burden. Public interest in the story was enormous. Local newspapers wrote about the man who came back from the woods, and TV channels showed footage of his hospitalization and testimony. However, the main question behind the attention was, what happened to Alex? The answer was never found. All the search missions that were organized after Mark's return ended in nothing. Due to the lack of an ending, this case was classified as open. It was not closed, but there were no grounds to declare a crime with specific perpetrators. It was a rare case when the official version contained signs of an attack, but nothing was legally moved forward. For Mark, life after the forest became an attempt to constantly balance between rehabilitation and guilt. He settled down under the supervision of his family, attended therapy, and tried to return to a normal life. But every time the image of Alex came up, he shut down. The only thing he repeated in public speeches was, "I want him to be found." The final note of this story sounded quiet and disturbing. The mountains remained the same as they had been 5 years before. The same domes, the same trails, and the fog that hid the horizons. The forest did not give a final answer. It returned one of the two, but took the other without a trace. Legally, it is an open case without a verdict. In human terms, it is a story of survival and guilt. For those who were waiting for the end, there was only the silence of the forest and the feeling that the last answer was still hidden somewhere among the slopes.